What's up, everybody? Today I'm doing a recap of the Pogchamps 3 match between Daniel Negreanu and Rubius. Let's go ahead and jump straight in. So in the first game, Rubius started with the white pieces, and he plays e4, c5, and now c3. He goes for the alapin. Now, with the alapin, the idea is to gain very quickly a strong center with this d4 push, and that's exactly what happened in this game. And now white has a big center advantage, a big center control, and that also could lead to space advantages because white always has the ability to push e5 or d5 in the future. And for the most part, you never want to allow your opponent to achieve this very nice central control. So already black is kind of a little worse here, and white finishes their development on the king side and castles very quickly. So far, Rubius playing the opening very nicely. However, what I will say is that black does not play this opening too well. Because what happens is that if you want to castle kingside, and for the most part, you should decide where you want to castle as early as you can. So here, obviously, black is probably going to castle on the king side because castling on the queen side just doesn't seem as safe. And for the most part, also typically in Sicilian defenses, you castle on the king side. So black knows that they want to castle on the king side, which is why you should play a move maybe like g6, for example, or e6, and prioritize getting this bishop out as quickly as possible and castling as quickly as possible. So you want to develop the pieces on the side of the board that you want to castle, because if you focus on developing your pieces on the queen side here for black, which is exactly what Daniel Negreanu did, notice that black has moved all of these three pieces, and even though individually these are good moves, you're putting your rook on an open file, you're putting the bishop on a long diagonal, you're putting the knight on a better square, maybe you can hop here in the future, you're delaying developing your pieces on the king side, which is something you should prioritize because you want to get your king as safe as possible. And you'll see later in this game why that is so important. So in this position, white develops their knight. We have e5 and now knight to d5, using this pin on the knight. And at this moment, Daniel Negreanu did not like this pin that occurred on the queen or on the knight towards the queen. And so he pushes g5. And this, although it does achieve the accomplishment of getting the pin away and stopping the pin, it also achieves maybe developing the bishop to g7. It also comes with a pretty major disadvantage, which is weakening your king side. And so you never want to push your pawns forward on the side that you want to castle, unless it is very, very important to do so. And so here, I don't think g5 is a great move. Although this pin is annoying, and I understand why Daniel Negreanu did this, I think you should definitely ask yourself twice: is it actually necessary to do something like this? Because it really weakens your king side. And although in this game I don't believe that we necessarily saw the drawback of this specifically, as a general rule, you should never aim to have such a weak king. In this position, we have the bishop dropping back, we have takes in the center, and this is the moment where you really understand why it's so bad to have your king right in the center. Notice that the rook is aiming towards the king, and if the king was castled, if black prioritized getting this bishop out and castling, before developing on the queen side, this would not really be much of a problem. But here, there's the ability to take, and suddenly, not only is this rook attacked, but you also have the sneaky threat of bishop c7 coming with the discovery. So if the rook moves, bishop c7 wins the queen because of the fact that the king is still in the center of the board. There's this check that occurs, and black is completely lost here. So it's very important, even if in this position, right, if we're going back to the opening, even if here it's not so clear exactly how white is going to immediately take advantage of the king in the center, the way that chess progresses, eventually there's that big risk that white will manage to eventually open up the center somehow, and it's much safer, it's a much better choice to develop on the king side, castle quickly, and then you could put your knight here, then you could put your rook here, but focus on developing on the king, on the side, that you want to castle, so your king gets out of the center early. However, here, instead of taking and going into the very pleasant line that I showed, the knight jumped back to d2, so this was a pretty bad move. Of course, you had the ability to not only win the pawn back, but also attack this king here. And Rubius realized that he made this mistake and he wanted to go back, so immediately he came back, but only this time it was a move too late. Black managed to castle, and even if you win the pawn here, it's just not as good as it would have been before. So recognizing that the king is right here in the center of the board, you want to take advantage of that as soon as possible. So you don't want to waste moving your knight back and forth. You want to immediately take here and open up the king side, because once again, if you do waste moves, black manages to castle and you're winning the pawn back, but again, it's not as powerful. Here actually Rubius made a pretty big mistake. It's not so easy to see why this is a mistake, but you should have taken with the knight, because if you take with the bishop, there's a very sneaky move. Bishop takes on f3, hitting the queen, and once the queen takes back, you've lost a defender because the knight was a defender, and black can simply take back the bishop here, because again, you only have one defender. However, in this game, Daniel Negreanu does not see this tactic. Instead, he pushes f6, the bishop hops back, and now rook to e8, we have rook to e3, we have a trade of rooks, and now e4, which is a pretty big mistake here. Of course, black can simply take the pawn, and I think if you're looking at this in the perspective of black, when your opponent pushes a pawn like this, you assume that it's not okay to take it, because why would they give you a free pawn? So as an instinct, you decide to just move your bishop back, which is what Daniel Negreanu did. But you should always, especially if you have time, which Daniel Negreanu did have. In fact, I think he had like 3 minutes more than Rubius here. You should just calculate and see, okay, if I take, he takes, wait a minute, I have a knight, I can just take, and so this would have been a free pawn that black could have captured. But instead, the bishop moves back, the queen comes to e2, and here we have knight takes on d3, and actually black missed another tactic here. It's not so easy to find this tactic, but you have g4 in this position, trying to remove the defender of the bishop, so of course, the threat is taking here and then being able to take this bishop here. And if you take here, then suddenly black can take the knight with an attack and then later recapture. And this is kind of falling apart for white. But in the game, we just have knight takes on d3. We have a trade that happens, queen to e3, and now e5. A pretty cool find here by Daniel Negreanu. Rook to e6, pinning this pawn. You cannot take, otherwise you lose your queen, and therefore afterwards black can then take the pawn. The queen comes to d8 to safety, and suddenly the big mistake here of the game, a bishop to b6, giving away a bishop for free. And actually, Daniel Negreanu didn't see this at first. At first he moved the queen, but then he captured the bishop when he had the second try. And I think this again kind of comes back to the idea that if your opponent plays this move, you assume that they just calculated everything and you should just move your queen to safety. But, if you actually then calculate, which is what Daniel Negreanu had the ability to do on the second try, then you realize, wait a minute, I could just take this bishop. And so, again, take your time, calculate what pieces are free, and that will help you, stop doing these very silly blunders where you're just missing these free pieces. So finally, the queen takes. The knight jumps here. Of course, black can just take the knight, but Negreanu misses this one as well. So there were many free pieces that Negreanu missed in this game. I think that's a pretty major thing that he should work on, because I mean, if he didn't miss these free pieces, he would have been in a much better position a long time ago. Rook comes to c8, the king moves, and although you do lose this bishop here, it's actually not as bad as it looks. Even though it kind of looks like now the game is completely even, it's not necessarily that way, because these two pieces are a lot more active, and even though this king does seem very unsafe, this king is actually even more unsafe. So bishop here to d4 is a beautiful move. The king cannot come here because you lose the knight like this, and so the king has to come to here, but then, or actually I guess h2 is better, which is what happened in the game, but then there's always that idea of this check, and so here the king can move, kick the knight away, and you can come here and try to pick up the knight, but even if you move away, you always have this threat, of picking up the knight like this, and in general, even if the black king manages to come here, then this would actually not even threat the knight, it would threaten checkmate. And so just because of how unsafe this king is, even in the seemingly even endgame, black is just much, much better here. The game continued with a check. There was this trade ability, but instead of trading, we see black taking the free bishop here, the free pawn here. Although in this position, there was that ability to do this check. The king moves. Of course, now you have to take with the bishop. If you take with the rook, you drop your own bishop, but then you're just up material. This is very, very pleasant for you. But instead of this, black just took the pawn, which of course is still winning. And here he finally picks up the knight. And in this endgame, he manages to convert. There was one last thing here. You had the ability to play rook to h2, taking this rook, well, trading the rook. And even though you're not winning material, if you're up in material in an endgame, you want to trade down. And so here that would have been a smart choice from black. But instead, of course, this is just very winning. Black picks up everything, and all is good. So let's move on at this point to game number 2. This second game was very messy. Daniel Negreanu started with the white pieces, and it started normally in this very common Scandinavian defense. Black takes back the pawn, but then what ends up happening is that white manages to castle very quickly, but white fails to gain enough space. And this is what ends up happening if you don't control the center with a pawn by pushing d4. And in general, if you don't have enough pawns controlling the board, you won't be able to control enough surface, and you're just going to get crushed. And this is kind of what happened here. Notice that black managed to control the center, and even though you don't want to start pushing all of your pawns to gain space, you do want to have at least some pawns advance, so you do have some sort of space on the board. And so you don't, this, what happened here does not happen to you. So white does manage to push this pawn to c4, but what ends up happening is that black manages to end up pushing both of these pawns here and start to advance these pawns very, very nicely and kick this knight away. And once the knight moves, there's even e3 here, check. And if the knight comes back, then just f4. And look at how solid black is here. They have so much space. There's ideas potentially, for example, let's say takes. If white decides to take, then there's knight here hitting the bishop moves back. There's even check here winning the knight. So because of how much space these pawns here manage to give to black, there's all of these beautiful attacking possibilities that black can go for, and it's just looking very, very unpleasant for white here. Again, I want to make sure to make it very clear, you don't want to just start pushing your pawns towards your opponent aimlessly, because that's going to make a lot of weaknesses, and that's actually kind of what white did. For example, this pawn here, it's not necessarily a good piece. The king is now a lot more open, but notice that black has pushed pawns very, very nicely. These two pawns are here to still defend the king, but then these pawns here are gaining space and attacking this other king. And so you want to kind of have that balance of pushing some pawns, gaining space, but then also keeping your own position and your own king safe. Here in this position, however, black made a little mistake and pushed the wrong pawn. Here, if you push this pawn, we get into that position like I showed you, where you have this very nice control. But if you push this other pawn, you just give away this one pawn here, and now white is completely back in the game. And this is actually looking very pleasant for white here, although black is probably still better, I would say, just because of again, this very nice pawn here gaining space, the position of this knight here in a very nice outpost. And overall, this king is just looking a lot less safe than this king, and black is the one here attacking. We have h5 now, the rook coming to f5. The pawn is basically forced to push forward, because otherwise, this pawn's attacked here, and there's maybe ideas of taking, and then taking, for example. In this game, however, the pawn pushes forward. We have bishop coming here, and in this position, this was the first major blunder where Rubius just gave away a free piece. The rook is obviously hanging in this position, and white is just up material now. However, Daniel Negreanu very quickly gave back that piece by just playing bishop to e6 check. I assume he just thought that, okay, why not do a check here? He didn't see this knight is simply controlling that square. The knight takes, and suddenly, this is just a very, very messy game here. The queen takes this pawn, and now the black gives away the queen to white by playing queen takes on e4. Of course, the knight can just take. I assume what happened is that Rubius calculated queen takes the queen, and then after bishop takes, that's much better for black. However, whenever you have this time when you're calculating, you need to calculate all of the responses by white, not just one of them that ends up working out in your favor. So it's just a very messy game. You lose the queen, but even here, actually, it's not even clear that white is even better. Maybe there's, for example, knight to e2 check, putting the knight in a very powerful place. maybe the king moves, and then you can maybe take this rook. So I don't know that it's that clear here that white is even better, even being up the queen that black gave. So it's just a very messy game in this position. Of course, once you block this, then this knight is also hanging. So it's very unclear what's going on here. In this position, black takes the knight on e4. We have this trade that happens, and simply once you take the bishop here, you're eyeing down this rook. So you take this rook, but then after check, I mean, it's actually really beautiful. This pawn here advanced blocks the king's escape, so you have to give away the bishop, but then there's checkmate. So this is the end of the game. Daniel Negreanu won in a very messy fashion. I would even say both games. There was certainly chances where Rubius was much, much better, even winning in both of the games. It was just a very messy result, but in the end, Daniel Negreanu won. Let me know down below who your favorite Pogchamps contestant is. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe for more videos like these, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.